All right. So, said I would get back on again and start streaming some more. So, thought I would get back online and stream some more. Trying to think of some good examples of stories that could be adapted for film. Uh, what's some good stuff that's been ignored recently? A big character that I think's been ignored. I'm not entirely sure why. Is Mr. Majestic from Wildstorm. I think Mr. Majestic is a really interesting character. I'm surprised someone like Zack Snyder hasn't gotten on Mr. Majestic and trying to do more with that character. Um, I think Zack Snyder has always wanted to do darker characters, a darker Superman. So I don't know why he didn't want to jump on Mr. Majestic, which is really that dark and gritty Superman character, especially when you have so much more room to reinvent that character. That many people know who that is. Great design, some great art from Jim Lee's been made. Ed McGuinness did some great stuff with Mr. Majestic. Really, the whole Wildstorm universe should be adapted to film. I'm not entirely sure why the DC animated universe has never really touched on Wildstorm. They actually brought in Icon for Young Justice, but I don't know why there's never been a push to bring the Wildstorm characters into the fold because they do own them. And there are quite a few interesting characters in the Wildstorm fold. Grifter is another one with the great visuals. Now, he showed up in the Flashpoint animated film, but it seems like he's also in Future State too. He was in Future State earlier this year, but it seems like DC is hesitant to really pull Wildstorm characters over into live action. I don't know, maybe it's something legal. Maybe there's something with Jim Lee right now that maybe he has an extremely favorable contract because they were all sold and he became co-publisher as a result of the sale. So maybe there's just shenanigans legally that prohibit Wildstorm from really being used to the max. But there are quite a few great concepts and characters over at Wildstorm that haven't been used on the DC side. But even in the characters that have been used, there's still some really interesting Batman stories out there. The Batman Vampire stories, Batman Year 2, No Man's Land. No Man's Land is when Batman actually is left alone after an earthquake secludes Gotham and separates it from the rest of the country. And that's a concept that really could be explored to interesting effect. I think they touched on it a little bit in Batman Begins and in The Dark Knight Rises. They kind of get the same effect, but the Batman character really hasn't been allowed to go broad, go big, go really cartoony, really be a comic book character in live action. I think Tim Burton got the closest, but his focus was more on the architecture, creating something larger than life, more gothic, more sharp, more unusual and uncomfortable and claustrophobic from a design standpoint. I don't know that anyone has ever created that cartoony Mad Hatter, Killer Croc, Clock King, giving us really weird characters. Bronze Tiger. I believe Bronze Tiger's been on Arrow though. Who else? I mean, Batmite, but Batmite really, there's no use for Batmite in live action. Who else? Bigger Batman characters that aren't really used very often. Two-Face's Judge persona hasn't been used recently. There are quite a few Batman characters that I think could be brought to life in live action and could be more interesting and less serious. I don't think Batman is necessarily synonymous with being serious. I think Grant Morrison went to great pains to try to separate Batman as a concept from being serious. To that point, he brought in Professor Pig, and I think Professor Pig is an interesting example of someone that kind of walks the line. Professor Pig is serious insofar as he's a murderer, but he's someone that Batman doesn't really have too much trouble taking down. But within his world, within his universe, the victims that he hunts down, they all see him as a threat. So Professor Pig is interesting. The stuff that Scott Snyder did with Commissioner Gordon's son, that's an interesting angle that they could touch on more. Who else is kind of broad, kind of a larger than life? Firefly would be an interesting one. I'd like to see more. Firefly is interesting, but I don't want to just devolve into only talking about Batman characters that need to be adapted. Superman is a character that hasn't been fully explored in live action. I think everyone can agree. We tend to go back to Lex Luthor a lot as the villain or Zod as the villain. And I think it's just executives playing it safe because that's what worked the first time. So they just continue to repeat that to their detriment. One storyline I think is great that I want to say Zack Snyder started to touch on and then kind of shied away from is Superman Birthright by Mark Waid and Leinil Yu, one of the best Superman comics. It seems like Zack Snyder wanted to talk about it, wanted to get into, what was Superman doing when he was younger? What's that about? How did he build his reputation as a great journalist? And then he just kind of backed away from it. I don't know, maybe he didn't find it very interesting. They bring it up a little bit in it, or they almost put some of the Superman Birthright traits on Lois Lane in the beginning of Batman versus Superman. And to that end, I think The Dark Knight Returns could be brought to live action. I guess Michael Keaton is doing something to that effect, some kind of a hybrid between that and Tim Burton's work with this new Flash movie. But Zack Snyder borrowed a lot of the iconography of that. There's been an animated adaptation, so people are aware of Frank Miller's work. They are interested in Frank Miller's work, but for whatever reason, we still haven't gotten that one-to-one translation. Who else is out there? Plastic Man has been languishing for a long time. Ethan Van Sciver's been talking about Plastic Man off and on for at least the last 10 years. Who else is interesting? Vixen. I think Vixen is interesting because she's black, female, has a really good power, but for some reason hasn't been utilized very much. She kind of jumps in and out of the comic books, but hasn't been explored very much. I would say Vixen, Manhunter, and Jessica Cruz are three female characters that could really work in live action. Jessica Cruz more would be appropriate for maybe like an HBO Max. But Manhunter could be a low budget film for sure. Guess we'll just see. Talk to you later.